The airport terminal buzzed with the usual mix of excitement and exhaustion. Passengers hurried to their gates, flight announcements echoed overhead, and airline employees moved with mechanical precision. Emily Carter adjusted her neatly pressed uniform and checked her watch. Boarding for Flight AW219 to New York was running on schedule. A decade of experience had made her efficient, some might even say robotic, in her adherence to protocol. There was comfort in the rules. She stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin, scanning the steady stream of passengers settling into their plush seats. Businessmen with their laptops, an elderly woman adjusting her silk scarf, a couple murmuring in French. Everything looked as it should. Then, two black boys appeared in the aisle, standing hesitantly by a pair of first-class seats. They were dressed casually. Michael, the older one, wore a gray hoodie, while Daniel, the younger, had a NASA backpack strapped to his shoulders. Their wide eyes flicked between their seats and the overhead compartments. Unaccompanied minors. Emily's stomach tightened. Something felt off. She stepped forward, her tone polite but firm. "Boys, can I help you find your seats?" Michael, standing slightly in front of his younger brother, straightened his shoulders. No, ma'am. These are our seats. 2A and 2B. Emily glanced at the luxurious leather seats, then back at them. A flicker of doubt crossed her mind, but she ignored it. Kids their age usually sat in economy. Parents rarely paid for first-class seats unless they were traveling with them. "Are you sure?" she pressed. "Let me see your boarding passes." Daniel, the younger one, bit his lip. "We already showed them at the gate." Michael held up his crumpled ticket stub, clearly growing irritated. "We're supposed to be here." Emily's voice cooled. "I just need to verify, sweetheart." The endearment landed like a slap. Michael's jaw tightened, and Daniel shifted uncomfortably. She gestured to a nearby flight attendant. "Can you double-check their seats? Something's not adding up." Passengers nearby started watching. A man across the aisle glanced up from his newspaper. A woman with a tablet lowered her screen slightly. No one said anything. Michael exhaled sharply. "We already..." Before he could finish, another attendant returned, shaking her head. "Their names don't seem to be on the first-class manifest." Emily felt a rush of vindication. She knew something was wrong. "Okay, boys, let's not hold up the boarding process." "Why don't we?" Michael snapped. "We're in the right seats. Check again." His voice wasn't loud, but it was filled with frustration. Emily felt a twinge of unease, but she didn't back down. "Lower your voice," she said firmly. "There's no need to make a scene." Daniel tugged at his brother's sleeve. "Michael." But Michael was done being polite. "We have our tickets. Just check them." By now, a few passengers were openly staring. Some whispered to each other. A middle-aged man in a suit frowned but said nothing. Emily turned to a security officer standing near the cockpit. "We might have a seating issue here. Can you escort these young men out while we sort this out?" Daniel let out a small, embarrassed gasp. His fingers tightened around the strap of his backpack. Michael looked at his brother, then back at Emily. Disbelief flooded his expression. "Are you serious? You're kicking us off." Emily forced a tight smile, trying to keep control. "No one's being kicked off, sweetheart. We just need to confirm your seats." "I told you, we're in the right seats." The security officer stepped forward. "Let's go, boys." Michael's breathing turned shaky, but he grabbed his brother's wrist and pulled him toward the aisle. "Come on, Daniel." Daniel hesitated, his face burning with humiliation. "But our seats." Michael's voice was flat, cold. "Doesn't matter." They walked off the plane in silence. Passengers shifted uncomfortably. A woman in row 3 shook her head, muttering something under her breath. A younger man looked like he might say something, but he didn't. Emily exhaled, ignoring the small knot in her stomach. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? Outside, in the waiting area, Michael and Daniel stood stiffly near the boarding gate, their bags at their feet. Daniel's eyes were glassy, his small fingers gripping his NASA backpack. "We didn't do anything wrong," he murmured. Michael stared straight ahead, arms crossed. Doesn't matter. A few feet away, a man in a navy suit approached. Tall, composed, expensive watch. His eyes flickered with concern as he spotted them. Richard Collins, CEO of Atlantic Wings Airlines. Their father. His voice was calm, but the edge of steel was unmistakable. Boys, why aren't you on the plane? Daniel's lip trembled. They said, we weren't supposed to be in first class. Richard's expression didn't change, but his entire presence shifted. Who? His voice was sharper now. Michael lifted his chin. The flight attendant. She didn't even check our tickets. Just assumed. A beat of silence. Then, Richard turned toward the jet bridge, his movements slow and deliberate. Come with me. Daniel hesitated. Dad. Richard placed a firm hand on his son's shoulder, guiding him toward the plane. No. As they walked, an airline employee hesitated nearby, the one who had recognized them earlier. His mouth opened slightly, but Richard's icy stare made him look away. They stepped onto the jet bridge. Inside the plane, Emily was securing the overhead compartments, forcing herself to ignore the strange tension lingering in the cabin. Then, the murmurs started again. She turned and froze. Richard Collins stood at the entrance of the first-class cabin, his sons beside him. Emily's stomach dropped. Passengers stopped talking. Crew members stiffened. Richard didn't blink as he locked eyes with her. In a voice that carried through the silent cabin, he asked one simple question. Would you like to explain why my sons were removed from their seats? Silence. A heavy, suffocating silence that spread through the first-class cabin like turbulence no one saw coming. Every passenger, every flight attendant, and every security officer stood frozen, eyes flicking between Emily and Richard Collins. Emily felt the blood drain from her face. Her pulse pounded in her ears, drowning out the faint hum of the plane's engines. She had made a mistake. A terrible mistake. And now, the most powerful man in the airline was standing in front of her, waiting for an answer. Richard's voice came again, calm but razor-sharp. Explain. Emily forced herself to breathe, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Mr. Collins, I was simply following standard procedure. There was a seating discrepancy, and Richard's eyebrow lifted ever so slightly. A seating discrepancy? Michael, standing just behind his father, let out a bitter laugh. She didn't even check our tickets. A ripple of uneasy murmurs ran through the cabin. A woman in 3C adjusted her posture, suddenly looking more interested in the confrontation than in her in-flight magazine. Emily's jaw locked. She could feel the passengers watching, waiting, judging. Her authority, something she had spent years building, was slipping away, piece by piece. She cleared her throat. I asked to verify their seats, and when the manifest didn't show their names. Richard tilted his head slightly, cutting her off. So you assumed they didn't belong? His voice was still even, but it carried the force of a commanding officer addressing a soldier who had failed in battle. Emily swallowed hard. I would have done the same with any unaccompanied minors in first class. Richard's gaze didn't waver. Is that so? His voice was impossibly calm. Emily's hands clenched into fists at her sides, a defensive fire sparking deep in her chest. She wasn't a bad person. She had followed the rules. Why was she being treated like a criminal? Sir, I was simply ensuring the integrity of the seating arrangements, she said, her voice regaining some of its professional edge. Mistakes happen. I apologize if there was a misunderstanding. Michael let out another harsh laugh, shaking his head. Daniel, standing beside him, kept his eyes down, his fingers gripping the straps of his backpack like a lifeline. Richard's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered behind his eyes. A misunderstanding, he repeated. Emily nodded quickly, desperate to move past this. Yes, exactly. It was an unfortunate mix-up, and Do you know who booked these seats? Richard interrupted, his voice low and precise. Emily's mouth opened, then closed. Richard took a small step forward. My wife. A beat of absolute silence. Emily blinked. She booked them months ago, Richard continued, his tone still controlled, but his words landed like blows. For my sons. For their first flight alone. Because she wanted them to feel safe. Because she wanted them to feel special. Emily felt her breath hitch. She spent weeks planning every detail, Richard continued, because she knew this would be their first trip without her. Something in his voice changed. Something heavier. Emily's stomach twisted. I don't, she started, her words faltering. She passed away, Richard said, cutting through her excuses like a scalpel. 6 months ago. A sharp, collective intake of breath filled the cabin. Emily's vision blurred for a second. She could feel the weight of every passenger's stare, hot and unrelenting. She had done this. She had taken an already painful moment for these boys and made it worse. For the first time, she didn't just feel embarrassed, she felt ashamed. Richard took another small step closer, his presence overwhelming. So tell me again, Miss Carter. Was it a misunderstanding? Emily couldn't speak. Her throat felt tight, like she had swallowed glass. Passengers were still watching, their eyes flicking between her and Richard. Some looked disgusted. Others looked curious, like they were witnessing some real-life scandal unfolding. The crew stood awkwardly, avoiding eye contact. Even the security officer, who had so readily removed the boys earlier, now looked uneasy. Emily forced herself to straighten. She had to say something. I deeply regret that this happened, she whispered, but it wasn't personal. Michael scoffed. Felt personal. Emily flinched. Daniel finally lifted his gaze, his young face full of something Emily couldn't bear to name. Disappointment. Richard sighed, rubbing his temple. For a moment, he looked tired. He turned to his sons. Get back in your seats. Michael and Daniel hesitated, then nodded, moving past Emily without looking at her. Emily swallowed, then glanced at Richard. Sir, Richard didn't let her finish. You humiliated them, he said, voice clipped. In front of strangers. You took something my wife planned with love and turned it into a nightmare. Emily's throat tightened. I should have checked the tickets, she whispered, feeling a humility she wasn't used to feeling. Yes, Richard said coldly. You should have. Another wave of silence. Then, Richard took a breath and straightened his cuffs. I'll be speaking to your supervisor, he said. Emily nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak. Richard took one last long, piercing look at her, then turned and walked back to his sons, who were already settling into their seats. Emily stood there for a moment, feeling utterly exposed. Then, slowly, she turned. Passengers quickly looked away, pretending to be busy with their books, their phones, their drinks. No one wanted to meet her eyes. She had never felt so small in her life. The overhead speakers crackled, announcing that the flight would be departing shortly. Emily numbly went back to her tasks, but her hands trembled as she adjusted the seatbelts. She had followed the rules. So why did she feel like she had just made the biggest mistake of her career? The flight from Los Angeles to New York was the longest of Emily Carter's life. She moved through the motions, fastening seatbelts, taking meal requests, answering passengers with a mechanical politeness that felt foreign even to her. Every time she passed by Michael and Daniel Collins, her throat tightened. They didn't look at her. Not once. Richard Collins, seated beside them, barely acknowledged her presence either. His attention stayed on his sons, occasionally checking his phone or staring out the window with attention that never left his face. It was a relief when they finally landed at JFK. Emily remained by the exit, forcing a plastic smile as passengers disembarked. Most ignored her. Some cast her a glance, a mixture of curiosity and quiet judgment. The Collins family was among the last to leave. Richard stepped off first, followed by Michael, who walked past Emily without a word. But Daniel hesitated. For a brief second, he looked up at her, his face still full of that quiet, piercing disappointment. Emily opened her mouth, but before she could find a single word, Daniel looked away and walked off. She watched them disappear into the crowded terminal, an unsettling hollowness forming inside her chest. She had never felt so small. And it was only the beginning. The call. Emily was still in uniform when she was summoned to the manager's office the next morning. The email had been waiting in her inbox when she woke up. Urgent meeting. Mandatory. No delay. She barely slept the night before, restless, checking her phone, unsure of what she was even waiting for. But when she stepped into the office and saw 3 people already seated, her direct supervisor, a corporate HR representative, and the airline's regional director, she knew. She was screwed. Her supervisor, Nancy Whitmore, a woman with years of experience and a reputation for being firm but fair, didn't waste time. "Emily," she began, folding her hands on the desk. "I assume you understand why we're here." Emily nodded slowly, feeling a dull pressure behind her eyes. "I do." Nancy sighed. "Then I'll be blunt. What the hell were you thinking?" Emily's stomach dropped. The HR rep, a younger man with sharp glasses and a tablet, cleared his throat. "Do you realize this incident has already reached over 2 million views online?" Emily's pulse spiked. I didn't know." The regional director, a man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair, tapped his fingers on the desk. "Of course you didn't. But everyone else does." He turned the tablet toward her. "Take a look." Emily hesitated before leaning in. The screen played a video from inside the plane. The footage was grainy but undeniable. The angle, likely from a passenger's phone, showed the entire confrontation. Her questioning the boys, security leading them away, Richard Collins tearing her apart in front of the entire cabin. The caption read, "Airline CEO's sons kicked out of first class. Racism or misunderstanding?" Emily felt like she was suffocating. Nancy's voice was sharp. "Do you realize the damage this has done to the company? To your career?" Emily opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing she could say. "I wasn't trying to," she finally choked out. Nancy cut her off. "No. Don't do that." Emily blinked. "Do what?" Nancy's eyes burned into her. "Make yourself the victim." Silence. Emily swallowed, humiliation crawling up her throat like poison. The HR rep sighed, glancing at his notes. "The company is issuing a public apology. Diversity training will be mandatory for all employees, effective immediately." He looked at her. "Including you." Emily's mouth felt dry. "I understand." The regional director crossed his arms. "You're suspended. Indefinitely." Emily felt like the floor had been ripped out from under her. "Suspended?" She started, but no one looked interested in hearing her excuses. Nancy stood up, signaling the meeting was over. "I suggest you use this time to reflect, Emily." Emily nodded numbly, stood, and walked out. The moment the door closed behind her, she leaned against the wall and let out a shaky breath. This was worse than she had imagined. The backlash. The first time Emily checked her phone, it was a mistake. Her work email was flooded with messages. From colleagues, from management, even from people she didn't know. Some were neutral. Some were blisteringly cruel. Her name was trending on Twitter. People had dug through her past, analyzing every social media post, every moment of her career. Strangers called her racist. Her stomach turned as she scrolled through the comments. She probably does this all the time and just got caught now. Imagine how many people like her work in customer service. No wonder flying while black is a nightmare. She didn't even check the tickets? Unbelievable. Emily locked her phone and stared at the ceiling. She had followed the rules. But somehow, she had ended up here. She wasn't a bad person. So why did she feel like one of the villains in those viral stories she used to judge so easily? The letter. 2 days into her suspension, a letter arrived at her apartment. Handwritten. No return address. Her hands shook as she opened it. The first words made her exhale sharply. "Dear Miss Carter, I was mad at you. I still am. But I hope you learned something from this. Because my mom used to say, the best apologies aren't words. They're what you do next. So what are you going to do? Michael Collins." Emily sat on the floor, staring at the paper. The weight of it crushed her. For the first time, she realized saying sorry wasn't enough. She had to become better. And she wasn't sure she knew how. But she had to try. Emily Carter had spent her entire career believing she was good at her job. Now, she wasn't sure if she even knew who she was anymore. 2 weeks had passed since the incident. 2 weeks since her name became synonymous with discrimination and arrogance. 2 weeks since she had been forced off the schedule, stripped of her authority, and left to sit in the wreckage of her own making. And now, she was walking into something she never thought she'd be part of, a corporate re-education program. Her hands were clammy as she stepped into the conference room of the Atlantic Wings headquarters. The large space was already half full, with at least 20 employees, some flight attendants, some gate agents, a few pilots, seated in stiff rows of plastic chairs. Some of them were like her, people whose bad decisions had gone public. Others were here voluntarily, eager to prove their progressiveness or simply ticking a mandatory box. Emily kept her head down as she found a seat near the back. She could feel the weight of eyes on her. She knew what they were thinking. She was the one. The flight attendant from that video. The woman who had embarrassed the company, humiliated 2 kids, and ended up suspended because of it. No one spoke to her. She wasn't sure if that made it better or worse. The session. A tall black woman in a navy blazer stepped to the front of the room, her presence immediately commanding. "My name is Lena Morris," she introduced herself. "I've been with Atlantic Wings for 23 years. Before that, I worked for 2 other major airlines. I've seen a lot in this industry, and I'm going to tell you something straight." She let the silence settle for a moment. Bias in aviation is real, and every single person in this room, whether you realize it or not, has been part of it. A few people shifted uncomfortably. Emily stiffened. Lena's gaze swept over the group. "Let's talk about why you're here." She turned toward a young man in a pilot's uniform. "John, why are you here?" John cleared his throat, looking embarrassed. There was a passenger. Middle Eastern. I profiled him. Thought he looked suspicious because of his backpack." Lena nodded once. "And?" John swallowed. "He was an off-duty doctor, flying to visit his sick mother." The air felt heavy. Lena turned to a gate agent sitting up front. "Maria." Maria's voice was small. "I made an assumption about a disabled passenger. Thought he couldn't travel alone. I was wrong." One by one, Lena made them say it. What they had done. Who they had hurt. Why they were here. Emily's pulse pounded as the focus shifted toward her. Lena's eyes met hers. "Emily." Emily's throat tightened. She wasn't ready for this. I misjudged 2 unaccompanied minors," she said carefully. "I should have checked their tickets before jumping to conclusions." Lena studied her, waiting. Emily held her breath. "And then?" "That's not what happened." Emily's stomach dropped. Lena's voice was even, but firm. "You didn't just misjudge them. You humiliated them. You made them feel like they didn't belong in a space their own family paid for." A few heads turned toward Emily, waiting for her response. Her face burned. She wanted to say it wasn't like that. That she had just been doing her job. That she had followed protocol. But had she? Or had she just assumed? Emily felt something crack inside her. She looked down, swallowing hard. "I messed up." Lena nodded once. "Yes, you did." And for the first time since it happened, Emily let herself feel the full weight of it. The encounter. The session lasted 3 hours. By the time it was over, Emily felt mentally drained. She was about to leave when she heard a voice behind her. "I almost didn't recognize you." Emily turned and froze. It was Marcus Johnson, a former colleague. Someone she had worked with for years. A black flight attendant who had left Atlantic Wings 2 years ago. He wasn't smiling. "Didn't think I'd ever see you at something like this," he said, his arms crossed. Emily's stomach twisted. Marcus had always been respectful, friendly, but also observant. He had called things out before. Things Emily had ignored. "You're here for the Collins thing, huh?" he asked, raising an eyebrow. Emily exhaled slowly. "Yeah." Marcus tilted his head. "You really think that's the first time you ever did something like that?" The question hit her harder than she expected. She opened her mouth to deny it, but stopped. Because suddenly, she remembered things. Small things. Moments she had dismissed. The way she watched certain passengers more closely than others. The way she felt instinctively suspicious of certain last names. The way she had ignored Marcus when he had told her, years ago, that these things happened to him all the time. She had always thought of herself as someone who followed the rules. But now, she wasn't sure if that was true. She hesitated. I don't know. Marcus sighed, shaking his head. At least you're honest. Emily forced a small, exhausted smile. I'm trying. Marcus studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. Just make sure it actually means something. With that, he walked away. Emily stood there, her mind spinning. For the first time, she wasn't just processing the fallout of her mistake. She was questioning everything. 2 months later, Emily Carter stood in front of Gate 27 at JFK International Airport, watching passengers move toward their flight. She hadn't worn her uniform in weeks, but today, she was here on her own terms. Her suspension had ended last week, and the airline had offered her job back. She hadn't accepted it. Not yet. Her hands tightened around the strap of her bag as she scanned the gate. She wasn't even sure why she was here. Until she saw them. Michael and Daniel. The boys stood near the boarding area, side by side, their father talking to an airline employee nearby. Emily felt her pulse spike. This was it. Her chance to say what she should have said that day on the plane. Her chance to face them. The approach. Emily forced her feet to move, heart hammering in her chest. She stopped a few feet away, waiting for them to notice her. Michael saw her first. His expression didn't change. Daniel looked up a second later. His eyes flickered with something Emily couldn't quite place. A second of silence stretched between them. Then, finally, Michael spoke. What do you want? Emily took a breath. To apologize. For real this time. Michael's arms crossed over his chest. He looked skeptical, but he didn't walk away. Emily hesitated, then crouched slightly, so she was at Daniel's height. I was wrong, she said, her voice steady. And I hurt you both. I don't expect you to forgive me. But I want you to know I've spent the last 2 months thinking about what I did. And I promise you, I'll never make that mistake again. Daniel studied her, his fingers gripping his backpack straps. Michael's eyes narrowed slightly, as if trying to gauge if she meant it. The silence stretched again. Then, to her shock, Daniel spoke. Are you still a flight attendant? Emily exhaled slowly. I don't know. I was offered my job back. But I haven't decided if I should take it. Michael's expression remained unreadable. Why not? Emily gave a small, self-deprecating smile. Because I'm trying to figure out if I deserve it. Michael blinked, caught off guard by her honesty. For the first time since they met, his expression softened, just slightly. Daniel nudged him. She's trying, Michael. Michael didn't respond right away. Then, finally, he nodded. Not forgiveness. Not yet. But something close to acceptance. Emily felt a knot loosen in her chest. It wasn't much. But it was enough. The final conversation. She had just turned to leave when she heard another voice. Miss Carter. Emily turned and froze. Richard Collins was standing just a few feet away. His gaze was steady, measured, not angry, but not entirely warm either. Emily braced herself. Richard glanced at his sons, then back at her. I heard what you said. Emily straightened, forcing herself to meet his eyes. I meant it. Richard studied her for a moment. Then, to her surprise, he sighed. I've worked in this industry for years. Long enough to know it's filled with people who never stop to question themselves. He paused. But you did. Emily felt a lump form in her throat. Richard exhaled, glancing at his sons. They're still hurt. I won't pretend this is something they'll forget anytime soon. Emily nodded. I understand. Richard's gaze hardened slightly. But if you go back to your job, make sure you remember how this felt. Make sure you don't just learn from this. Make sure you change. Emily swallowed. I will. Richard nodded once. Then that's all I have to say. And just like that, he turned, placing a hand on Michael's shoulder as they moved toward the boarding gate. Daniel gave her one last look, a small, tentative half-smile, before following. Emily stood there, watching as they disappeared into the jet bridge. She let out a slow, unsteady breath. And for the first time in 2 months, she felt like she could breathe again. The decision. 2 weeks later, Emily Carter stepped onto an airplane. This time, she wasn't a passenger. She adjusted her uniform, took a deep breath, and walked down the aisle, feeling the familiar hum of the plane beneath her feet. She had taken her job back. Not because it was comfortable. Not because she wanted to prove anything to anyone. But because she wanted to do it right this time. As she secured the overhead compartments, she saw a young black girl sitting in first class. The girl looked up at her, wide-eyed, clutching a small stuffed panda in her lap. Emily smiled warmly. "First time flying?" she asked. The girl nodded hesitantly. Emily crouched down, her voice gentle. "It's going to be a great flight. If you need anything, I'm right here, okay?" The girl smiled back, relaxing slightly. And for the first time in a long time, Emily Carter knew she was exactly where she needed to be.